The laughter was the part that stayed with me. Not the words. I'd heard variations of those words my whole professional life, delivered by men who wore their certainty the way Preston Vance wore his coat that morning. Casually, expensively, like something that had never once needed to be proven. The words themselves were almost ordinary. It was the laughter that did something to the air. "That building is condemned," he said, and then he laughed. He was standing on the sidewalk in front of the Aldridge Mill, flanked by two men in suits whose job appeared to be holding clipboards and nodding. Vance himself held nothing. Men like Preston Vance had not carried their own things in a very long time. I was across the street, one hand wrapped around a paper coffee cup that had gone cold, watching. Nora stood beside me, her small shoulder pressed against my hip, her eyes on the building. "Dad," she said quietly, "why is that man laughing at a building?" "He's not laughing at the building," I said. "He's laughing at the idea that someone might want to save it." She considered this. Nora was 9 and had the habit, which she'd had since she was 4, of filing things away before she responded to them. She tilted her head the way she did when she was deciding something. "Does someone want to save it?" she asked. I looked at the Aldridge Mill. 4 stories of 1887 Flemish bond brick, river facing, its upper windows boarded, its iron cornices gone the color of old blood in the November light. The city condemnation notice had been stapled to the door in a bright orange square, and someone, a kid, probably, had written "Save the Mill" in black marker on the plywood below. Preston Vance and his clipboard men were still laughing about something. One of them pointed at the marker graffiti and said something that made Vance laugh again. "Yeah," I said, "someone does." Nora looked up at me. She pressed her shoulder harder against my hip, not leaning, just present. "Okay," she said, like it was settled. "I need to back up because none of that morning makes sense without the preceding 11 months, and those 11 months don't make sense without the 3 years before them, and those 3 years begin the way everything in my life now begins, with the absence of Maya. My wife died on a Tuesday in March, 3 years ago. She was 34. Nora was 6. The aneurysm was the kind that gave no warning and allowed no preparation, and the doctors who told me about it afterward were kind and careful and said everything right, and none of it helped at all. I am not going to spend a great deal of time on the grief itself. Grief is not a story. It is the thing that interrupts stories. What I will tell you is that I did not handle the first year well, that I handled the second year better, and that by the time the third year arrived I had come to a rough and provisional understanding with the shape of my life. The first year I operated on reflex. I got Nora to school and picked her up from school and made dinners that she ate without complaint, and sat beside her while she did homework and put her to bed, and then sat in the kitchen alone for a long time most nights, not doing much of anything. My firm gave me 8 weeks of bereavement leave and then asked me to come back. And I came back, because I needed somewhere to be during the hours Nora was in school, and because the alternative, being in the house, was its own kind of problem. The second year I learned to function again in a more conscious way. I started cooking real dinners rather than whatever required the fewest decisions. I started attending Nora's school events in a way that didn't feel purely mechanical. I found a grief therapist named Dr. Kwan who had the gift of sitting in silence without making it uncomfortable, and I saw her every 2 weeks for 14 months, and she helped me understand something that sounds simple but isn't. The structural engineer's principle applied to people too. The load had to go somewhere. If you didn't design a proper load path, the structure found its own, and it wasn't always the path you'd want. The shape was this by the third year. I was a single father in a mid-sized city, working as a structural engineer for a regional consulting firm, raising a daughter who was too perceptive for her own comfort and who had her mother's absolute talent for reading rooms. I had a salary, a mortgage, a pediatrician I liked, a mechanic I trusted, and a slow, grinding awareness that something about the life I was living did not fit me anymore. The engineering work had started to feel like translation, like I was converting my instincts about structures and loads and material behavior into a language that my firm's clients could accept, then watching those clients ignore half of what I'd told them because the cheaper option was more convenient. I had become, in the argot of my profession, a liability management tool, someone who signed off on things and absorbed the risk. I had a professional reputation I was proud of, and a job that used perhaps 40% of what I actually knew. The partners at the firm, three men in their 60s who had founded the company before I was born, and who managed it with the careful risk aversion of people who had built something and were primarily now protecting it, were not interested in the kind of work I'd come into the profession to do. They wanted assessments that cleared projects for construction. They wanted timely reports and manageable liability in clients who renewed their contracts. When I flagged a problem in a structural design that required real remediation, the conversation that followed was always about how to minimize the scope of the fix, not how to address what I'd found. I had 3 times, in my career at the firm, filed assessments that recommended against proceeding with a project on structural grounds. All 3 times, the clients had sought second opinions. All 3 times, the second opinions had agreed with me. In 2 of the 3 cases, the clients had found third opinions that told them what they wanted to hear, and in one of those 2 cases, a parking structure in a city I won't name had developed a significant deflection problem in its second year of operation that required a 6-figure remediation effort. I wasn't proud of any of that. I'd done the right thing technically, but the right thing technically hadn't prevented the outcome. And I had filed the outcome away in the category of things I understood about the profession and had no power to change, and I had kept going. Until the Aldridge Mill. This is the part where I tell you about the Aldridge Mill and how I came to be standing across the street from it. The short version: I had grown up in Millhaven, Kentucky. My father had worked at the mill, not the Aldridge Mill, a different one, a textile mill that closed in 1994, and I had spent the summers of my childhood running along the river that defined the town's eastern edge. When Maya died, I had stayed in the city because Nora was enrolled in a good school, and because moving felt like admitting something I wasn't ready to admit. But my Aunt Delia still lived in Millhaven. And the previous January she had called me on a Sunday evening with the studied casualness that meant she had something she'd been thinking about for a while. "The Aldridge Mill is going to be torn down," she said. "Delia, Preston Vance bought the parcels around it. He's going to put a hotel on the river. They've condemned the building." "Buildings get condemned all the time," I said. "It doesn't always mean they come down." "This one might," she said, "unless someone buys it and proves it's worth saving." There was a silence on the line that contained a number of things. "Delia," I said again. "I'm not saying anything," she said. "I'm just telling you what's happening." The Aldridge Mill had been part of the landscape of my childhood in the way that large buildings become part of a child's sense of place, not noticed daily, but constant. It stood at the east end of River Street, 4 stories of dark brick above the water, and it had been vacant for as long as I could remember. My father had told me once that his father had worked there for 3 years in the 1950s, operating one of the cotton gins on the ground floor. The mill had shut down its main operations in 1971 and had been used for storage afterward, then for light commercial, then for nothing. The last owner had let it run to ruin and defaulted on the taxes, and the city had taken it, and it had sat. It had sat for 22 years. I sat with Delia's call for 3 weeks. I told myself I was being rational, that I was not going to upend my daughter's life and my professional stability for a building I hadn't seen in 15 years. I told myself all of this with great conviction, and then I booked a weekend in Millhaven, ostensibly to visit Delia, and I stood in front of the Aldridge Mill on a gray January afternoon and looked at it for a long time. The condemnation notice had been stapled to the door in a bright orange square for 3 months by then. The plywood boarding on the windows was weathered, gray at the edges. The iron cornices along the roofline had gone the color of old blood. From the street, it looked like a building at the end of its life. I looked at it longer. What I saw was not what the condemnation report said. This is the part of the story that requires some translation. Most people, when they look at a building, see surfaces. They see the condition of the paint, the state of the windows, the cleanliness of the sidewalk. The condemnation report on the Aldridge Mill had been written by a city inspector named Gary Pruitt, whose background was in code compliance, not structural engineering. Gary Pruitt had looked at the Aldridge Mill's surfaces and written down what he saw: crumbling mortar at the window lintels, failed caulking, interior water infiltration on the upper floors, possible compromised floor joists on 4. What Gary Pruitt had not done was look at the building's bones. I did. The Aldridge Mill had been built in 1887 by a man named Ezra Aldridge, who had made his first money in cotton processing and spent a portion of it on a building that was supposed to outlast him. He had hired an engineer from Cincinnati. This was in the days when hiring a Cincinnati engineer was an extravagance that announced your seriousness, and that engineer had specified an interior structural frame of wrought iron and old-growth white oak timber. The brick exterior was a curtain wall. The weight of the building was not carried by the brick. I knew this from the County Historical Society records, which I had reviewed before driving down. What the records didn't tell me was whether the iron and timber frame was still intact after 136 years of weather, neglect, and a slow-motion institutional abandonment that had left the building in city receivership after the last owner defaulted on back taxes. Standing on the sidewalk in January, squinting at the upper stories, I could not see the frame, but I could read the building's posture. I could read the way the brick courses tracked across the facade, the absence of diagonal cracking at the corners that would indicate settlement, the way the floors presented at the windows level, not bowed. A building with failed structural bones doesn't hold its face like that. I stood there for a long time. A woman walking a dog went past me on the sidewalk and glanced at me, then at the building, then back at me, with the expression of someone who has caught a stranger doing something private and has decided to pretend they haven't. I needed to get inside. I took out my phone and photographed the building from 4 angles. I photographed the condemnation notice, the window boarding, the brick courses at the corner where I could see them most clearly. I photographed the base of the building where it met the sidewalk, looking for the differential movement that would show up as a gap or a step if the foundation were shifting. There was none. I walked around the building to the river side. The Aldridge Mill's rear elevation faced the water directly, a loading dock at grade, now boarded up, that would have received cotton bales from river barges for most of the mill's working life. The river-facing brick was in worse shape than the street elevation, the repointing more thoroughly failed, some of the lintels showing efflorescence that meant water had been getting into the wall cavity on this side for a long time. Still, the brick courses were level. The corners were plumb. The building wasn't settling into the ground. Whatever was happening to its skin, the thing underneath wasn't moving. I walked back to the street. I stood there for another 10 minutes. Then I called Delia. "I need to get inside it," I said. She was quiet for a moment. "I know," she said. "I'll call Phil." That had taken another 6 weeks and a letter to the city's property management office and a conversation with Mara Delacroix, which was its own thing entirely, and I'll get to it. Mara Delacroix was Millhaven's Director of Historic Preservation, a position that had been created by the previous mayor, and that the current mayor, who was friendlier to Preston Vance's development interests, had spent 2 years trying to defund. She had held it anyway. Through a combination of grant funding, she secured independently, and a stubbornness that the local paper had once described as impressive, and that she would later tell me she preferred to call professionally necessary. She had grown up in Millhaven, left for graduate school in architectural history at the University of Virginia, come back in her late 20s for reasons she had never fully explained to me, and had been fighting for the town's built heritage ever since, with the patient, unglamorous tenacity of someone who understood that preservation was mostly about showing up to meetings. She had saved a 1920s movie house from conversion to a parking garage. She had gotten a block of Victorian commercial buildings on the National Register. She had lost a fight over a 1950s diner that had been knocked down before she could file the paperwork, and she still, years later, had a photograph of it on her office wall. The Aldridge Mill was the one she wanted most, the one that mattered. I met her in the property management office on a Wednesday morning in February. She was already there when I arrived, sitting across from a man named Phil who managed the city's receivership properties, and she was in the middle of a sentence. The integrity of the structural assessment has to be questioned on its face, Phil, because Gary Prewitt is not a structural engineer, he's a code inspector, and there's a meaningful difference between. She stopped when I walked in. Phil looked relieved. Mr. Marsh, Phil said, I believe you and Ms. Delacroix have the same appointment. Mara Delacroix looked at me with the expression of someone encountering an unexpected variable. She was somewhere around my age, dark-haired, with the kind of focused attention in her eyes that I associated with people who had learned to pay close attention to things because the people they dealt with routinely didn't. You're here about the Aldridge Mill, she said. It was not a question. I am. What's your interest? I'd like to do a structural assessment. Something shifted in her expression. You're an engineer. I am. She looked at me for another moment. Then she turned back to Phil with a new argument in her eyes, and I understood that I had just become useful to her, and that this was not necessarily a comfortable position to be in. Phil spent 20 minutes explaining why the access permit was complicated. The condemnation order created liability questions. The city's insurer had flagged the property. Councilman Harrell had sent a memo about managing public access to receivership properties that was clearly aimed at the Aldridge Mill specifically. The councilman is concerned, Phil said, that assessments conducted by interested parties could create legal complications for the city's position. The city's position, Mara said, is that a building in its care should be evaluated honestly before being demolished. The city's position, Phil said carefully, is more complicated than that. What Phil meant, and what he couldn't say directly at a conference table with Mara present, was that Preston Vance had already been in conversations with 3 council members about the hotel project, and those conversations had included commitments about local hiring and tax revenue, and the kind of economic language that political people find more persuasive than structural engineering reports. I had understood this before I walked in. I had done some reading about Millhaven's recent political history, the way I read about a building's history before I assess it. You need to understand what forces have been acting on a thing before you can evaluate its current condition. I'm not an interested party in the legal sense, I said. I'm a contractor with relevant expertise. The assessment I'm proposing is an objective technical evaluation. The city benefits from having accurate information about its property, regardless of what decisions it makes afterward. Phil looked at me for a long moment. Then he looked at Mara. I'll need to consult with the city attorney, he said. The access permit took 3 more weeks. Mara pushed for it. Phil resisted. Councilman Doug Harrell, who sat on the property management committee, objected formally on the grounds that unsupervised access to a condemned structure created liability. What he meant, though Mara said it more directly than I would have, was that a favorable structural assessment would complicate Preston Vance's demolition timeline. By March, I had the permit. By March, I had also made the decision, or begun the decision, since these things are rarely made all at once, to leave my firm. I told my firm I was taking a leave of absence. I told the partners that I needed to attend to a family situation. Both of these things were technically true, and both of them masked the larger truth, which was that I had looked at the Aldridge Mill in January and felt something shift inside me that had not shifted in 3 years. The closest I can come to describing it is this. It felt like the moment when you find, in a structure you expected to be compromised, the evidence that the bones are sound. The thing you thought might be gone is still there. You just had to look properly. I enrolled Nora in Millhaven Elementary in the spring semester. I moved into Delia's guest room. I started going to the mill. I did not tell anyone in Millhaven that I was a structural engineer. This was not a calculated deception. It simply didn't come up. I presented myself as a contractor, a handyman who was interested in old buildings. The city inspector who granted me access looked at my coveralls and my tool belt and my work boots and filed me under a category that required no further investigation. People are very good at seeing what they expect to see. I had the permit laminated and carried it in my tool belt. I went to the mill 3 times a week, in the mornings before Nora got home from school. I had a system: camera first, then measurement, then sketches, then notes. I documented everything before I touched anything. Millhaven took notice of me in the way that small towns take notice of people they haven't categorized yet, not unfriendly, but attentive. The hardware store where I bought supplies knew who I was by my third visit. The diner where I ate lunch on Tuesdays remembered my order by the second week. A man named Earl, who ran the antiques shop 2 doors down from the mill, had apparently been watching the building for years. Watching it, waiting, he told me, with the fatalistic patience of someone who has learned not to expect things to go right. And he came out one morning to talk to me while I was working on the street elevation documentation. Earl was in his mid-70s and had spent his whole life in Millhaven, and he had opinions about the mill that were not architectural or structural but were something else, something harder to categorize. "My grandmother sewed curtains in that building," he said, "in the 40s. They did light manufacturing on the second floor for a while after the cotton processing ended. Sewing, piecework. She sewed there for 6 years." He looked at the building. "She used to say the windows let in good light," he said. She remembered the windows. I looked at the upper floor window openings. The proportions were good, the sash height relative to the width, the spacing on the facade, and I'd noticed them early as evidence of a thoughtful designer, someone who had understood that light mattered to the people who would work in the building. "She was right about the windows," I said. Earl looked at me sideways. "You really think you can save it?" "I think the building is in better condition than the report says," I said carefully. "I need to verify a few more things." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Preston Vance is going to build a hotel. I know. He's got half the council in his pocket. I know that too." He looked at the building again. Then he looked at me with an expression I've been seeing occasionally in Millhaven, an expression that was a question and a test at the same time, the kind of look a place gives a person it's deciding whether to trust. "My grandmother would have liked to know it was going to be all right," he said. I looked at the mill, at the brick courses level across the facade, at the way it stood. "Tell her it's going to be all right," I said. Earl was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded once and went back inside. I did not tell anyone in Millhaven that I was a structural engineer. This was not a calculated deception. It simply didn't come up. I presented myself as a contractor, a handyman who was interested in old buildings. The city inspector who granted me access looked at my coveralls and my tool belt and my work boots and filed me under a category that required no further investigation. People are very good at seeing what they expect to see. The Aldridge Mill's interior, the first time I walked it alone, was one of those experiences that is difficult to describe to anyone who doesn't have the particular sensibility that my profession develops. Most people would have seen a ruin. Plaster fallen from the upper floor ceilings in gray drifts, water-stained brick, windows that admitted cold river air through gaps in their plywood boarding. The smell of old wood and damp and time. I saw the frame. It was there. All 4 stories of it, the wrought iron columns spaced at 16 feet on center, the original timber beams running between them, the secondary joists carrying the floor decking. There was surface rust on the iron, and some of the timber showed staining from the water infiltration on 4, but the core, the thing that actually held the building up, was intact in a way that made me stand very still for a long moment. Old-growth white oak does not rot the way second-growth lumber does. It was a thing I had read in textbooks and seen in real structures exactly twice in my career. The density of the growth rings, the resin content of the heartwood, it created a kind of natural resistance that modern lumber simply doesn't have. The Cincinnati engineer Ezra Aldridge had hired in 1887 had specified it, and whoever had felled those trees had done their job, and 136 years later, the result was a structural frame that was embarrassing the condemnation report that had dismissed the building. I took my time. I documented everything: photos, hand sketches, measurements, core samples from the timber that I sent to a lab in Louisville. I moved through the building floor by floor, room by room, the way I had learned to move through structures in my 20s. Slowly, looking at what the building was telling me rather than what I expected it to say. The first floor had been the processing level, high ceilings to accommodate machinery, the columns spacing generous in a way that spoke to a designer thinking about function. The original machinery was long gone, removed sometime in the 1960s when the building's last commercial use had wound down, but the cast iron floor plates where the machinery had been anchored were still set in the concrete of the base slab, their bolt patterns describing the footprint of things that had worked here for 80 years. The second floor had been offices and supervisory space. Smaller rooms, partial height plank partition walls that were mostly intact, the remains of a glass panel ceiling grid that had once admitted light from above. The water infiltration on the upper floors hadn't reached here seriously. The damage was mostly cosmetic, the kind of deferred maintenance that accumulated over decades of disuse. Third floor, storage, originally. Open space, the column grid uninterrupted. A freight elevator shaft on the north wall that had been stripped of its mechanism but whose guide rails were still in place. I stood in the middle of the third floor on that first visit and looked up at the beam above me, close enough to touch, and ran my hand along the underside of it. Old-growth white oak, surfaced with a drawknife in 1887, had turned the color of dark honey over the decades. My hand came away with a faint residue of the original surface treatment, linseed oil, probably, something the mill's maintenance crew would have applied periodically to protect the structural timber. The beam was solid. It did not flex under my hand the way compromised wood does, that slight give that telegraphs internal decay. 4 was the worst. The water had come in through the parapet at the roof level, compromising the secondary joists across most of the floor plate. 3 of the secondary joists showed active deflection, a visible sag that told me I'd need to sister new material alongside them before the floor was loaded again. The decking itself was shot in the north corner, a roughly 8 by 12 area where I could see daylight through the boards when I got low with a flashlight. But the primary beams and the iron columns were untouched. The water had damaged what it could reach. It had not reached what mattered. I took core samples from 3 of the primary beams, 1/8-inch cores, plugged afterward with matching stock, and sent them to a materials testing lab in Louisville that did historic timber analysis. The results came back 6 weeks later. Heartwood density 48 pounds/cubic foot, moisture content 12%, no evidence of fungal infiltration. The lab report used the phrase exceptional preservation of structural properties for material of this age. I had read that phrase twice and then set the report down on Delia's kitchen table and sat there for a while. It was on the third visit, in April, that I found the sealed room. Sub-basement. The Aldridge Mill had a basement level used originally for machinery storage, and below that, accessible only through a trapdoor in the basement floor, a sub-basement that the historical records mentioned but did not describe in detail. I had assumed it was a root cellar or a mechanical pit. The trapdoor opened onto a wooden stair that was improbably sound. I descended with a flashlight. The sub-basement was perhaps 20 feet square, stone-walled, dry in the way that below-grade stone construction sometimes is the thermal mass keeping condensation from forming. There was old shelving along one wall that had collapsed into itself, and on the far wall there was a door. It had been sealed. Not locked, sealed, with what appeared to be a plaster skim coat applied over the seams and then painted. The paint had gone the color of the stone, and if I hadn't been running my flashlight along the wall at a low angle I might have missed it entirely. The technique was old, and whoever had done it had been thorough. I stood in front of it for a while. I did not open it that day. Part of this was practical. I hadn't brought the right tools, and I didn't want to damage whatever was behind it without understanding what I was dealing with. But part of it, I'll admit, was something less rational. The sealed door felt like a question I wasn't ready to answer yet, like the building was keeping something for the right moment. I went back upstairs. I kept working. By May, I had filed an informal structural assessment with the city property office. I called it informal because I filed it under my contractor's permit, not my engineering license, which I had not disclosed. This was intentional. The assessment said, in the careful language of the preliminary stage, the structural frame appears to be in substantially better condition than the condemnation report indicates, and a full engineering evaluation is warranted before demolition proceedings move forward. Phil, the property manager, forwarded it to Councilman Harrell. Councilman Harrell forwarded it to Preston Vance. Vance's response arrived through a lawyer, addressed to the city, and expressed politely devastating skepticism about the qualifications of the unnamed contractor who had conducted the assessment. The letter did not know my name. It didn't need to. It was aimed at the assessment's authority, and the assessment's authority rested on a contractor's permit. I was not present for the internal city discussion. Mara told me about it afterward. Harold said your assessment was a well-intentioned amateur exercise, she told me. We were standing on the sidewalk outside the mill in the May light, and she was holding a coffee cup in both hands and not quite looking at me. He said the council wouldn't consider halting demolition proceedings on the basis of an evaluation by someone without engineering credentials. Okay, I said. She did look at me then. That doesn't bother you. It tells me what I need to know. She watched me. Mara had the habit of watching me in a way that suggested she was waiting for me to say something that contradicted what she thought she knew. I'd noticed it from the beginning. I didn't find it unpleasant. What does it tell you? She asked. That I need to change my approach, I said. She nodded slow. The council scheduled a formal vote on the demolition order in July. 2 months. That's enough time, I said. She looked at me again with that particular attention of hers, the kind that had begun to feel less like scrutiny and more like something else, something I was being careful not to name yet. Enough time for what exactly? She said. To do this right, I said. The summer in Millhaven was the kind that settles into a town like sediment, slow, thick, close. Nora adapted to the elementary school with the quiet efficiency that she brought to most things, forming one close friendship with a girl named Bee who lived 2 blocks from Delia's house and who had the gift, rare at 9, of being able to be silent without it being awkward. Nora and Bee spent a lot of time at the river. Nora brought her sketchbook. She had been drawing the mill from different angles since February, and the drawings had gotten better as the months passed, not more elaborate, but more precise. She had started to notice what I noticed. The way the building's proportions worked, the regularity of the window spacing, the way the brick courses wrapped around the corners. She had also started coming to the mill with me on Saturday mornings, which had not been my plan but which felt, once it started, like something that had always been going to happen. She wore her yellow hard hat slightly too big, which she wore pushed back on her head, and carried her sketchbook and sat in whatever clear space was available on whatever floor I was working, and drew, and asked questions with the unhurried patience she brought to things she was actually interested in. The questions were not what I expected. I had anticipated questions about what things were. What is that? What does this do? Why does it look like that? Nora asked some of those in the beginning. But more often she asked questions about why. Not what a thing was called, but why it was designed the way it was, what problem it solved, what would happen if it were different. Why are the columns at 16 feet? She asked one Saturday in June, running her hand along the base of one of the iron columns. That's the span the original timber could carry efficiently, I said. Go wider and you need bigger timber. Go narrower and you're using more columns and more material. 16 was the optimization for the era. She considered this. So the person who designed it was thinking about efficiency. He was thinking about what the building needed to do and what was available to do it with. That's engineering. She wrote something in her sketchbook, not a drawing, a note. She was doing that more, writing notes alongside her drawings, dimensions, observations, questions she was saving for later. I noticed it and said nothing because saying something would have made her self-conscious about it, and I didn't want her to be self-conscious about it. In July, Delia took us to the county fair in Harlan, a 40-minute drive along roads that went through hollows and over creek beds and past farms that had been working the same land for 5 generations. Nora won a ribbon at the pie judging by entering a blueberry pie she had made herself with Delia's recipe and absolutely no assistance, having declared that she needed to do it herself and that I should leave the kitchen, please. She had placed the ribbon carefully in her sketchbook, folded around the front cover, and referred to it occasionally as proof of something she didn't specify. That same week, Delia told me what she'd been doing with her Thursday mornings. She had been talking to people about the mill. "You said you needed to buy it," she said. "I started thinking about who might help. Delia, I haven't said I need to buy it. You've been spending 6 months in a condemned building on your days off," she said. "What would you call that?" I didn't have an answer for that. "Ruth's son-in-law works at First Heritage," she said. "He says if you have a solid business plan and a clear rehabilitation scope, he thinks there's a conversation to be had. He's watched what's been happening with the mill." "He's from here, Caleb. A lot of people who are from here are watching." "This isn't a community fundraiser," I said. "I'm not asking people to. Nobody's asking anyone for anything," she said. "I'm telling you that people who care about this town have money they'd rather see used for this than for a Vance hotel. That's not charity, that's investment." I looked at her for a long time. "You've been planning this since January," I said. "I've been talking to people since January," she said. "Planning is different. Planning is what you do. I just make sure the right people know the right things." "Dad," she said one evening in June, showing me a new drawing, "the building isn't falling." "No," I said, "the report said it was falling." "The report was looking at the wrong things." She studied her own drawing. "How do you know which things are the wrong things?" This was the kind of question Nora asked, the kind that required a real answer, not a parental simplification. "You have to understand what the building is actually doing," I said. "Not what it looks like it's doing. You have to understand the system, how the weight is moving, where the forces are going. If you understand that, you can tell what matters and what's just surface damage." She considered this for a moment. "Like people," I looked at her. "Sometimes people look broken on the outside," she said carefully, "but the important parts are still there." I didn't say anything for a moment. "Yeah," I said. "Like people." She went back to her drawing. I watched her draw, the careful way she mapped the column spacing, counting the windows to get the proportions right. She had her mother's hands, the same way of holding a pencil, the same habit of resting the tip on the page for a moment before committing. "Dad," she said, not looking up. "Yeah. I'm glad we moved here." I looked at the side of her face. She was concentrating on her drawing and not looking at me, but there was something in her posture, a deliberateness, that told me the statement had not been casual. "Me too," I said. She nodded slightly, like I'd confirmed something she'd been working on. In late June, I made 2 decisions in the same week. The first was to file a complete licensed structural engineering report on the Aldridge Mill, under my full credentials and PE license number. The report ran 47 pages and covered the structural frame, the foundation system, the floor and roof systems, the envelope conditions, and a rehabilitation pathway. Its conclusion: the Aldridge Mill is structurally sound. The condemnation order is not supported by the engineering evidence. The second decision was to put in an offer on the building. The offer was made possible by Delia, who had, over the preceding months, been quietly doing something I had not fully tracked. She had been talking to people. She had grown up in Millhaven and had lived there for 61 years, and had the network of relationships that this kind of life produces, deep, lateral, made of accumulated favors and reciprocal trust. She had talked to her friend Ruth, who had talked to her son-in-law, who was a banker. She had talked to the woman who had run the pharmacy for 30 years and who had opinions about Preston Vance's hotel plan and the parking situation it would create. She had talked to people at her church and at the community garden and at the Thursday morning coffee group that met at the diner on Route 12. Delia told me none of this directly. What she told me on a Sunday evening in late June was, "I think I can get you the bridge financing for the purchase." I looked at her across the dinner table. "Delia, Caleb, how? People want this building to stand," she said. "I told them you could make it stand. Was I wrong?" I looked down at my hands. Then I looked up. "No," I said, "you weren't wrong." The city council meeting was scheduled for the 14th of July. The agenda item was the formal vote on the demolition order and up or down, after which Preston Vance's timeline would either proceed or stall. 2 weeks before the meeting, I submitted my engineering report to the city property office, the building department, the historic preservation office, and on Mara's recommendation, the state historic preservation office in Frankfurt. 1 week before the meeting, Preston Vance's lawyers sent a letter arguing that my report should not be admitted as evidence in the council proceedings because, and I am paraphrasing only slightly, a handyman operating under a contractor's permit was not a credible source of structural analysis. They did not know about the PE license. I had made a decision, back in the early spring, not to announce it. Not because I was hiding it, my license was public record. Anyone who looked would find it, but because I was curious what the process would look like if the assessment stood on its own merits first. This was, I will acknowledge, a choice that had consequences I hadn't fully anticipated. The day before the council meeting, Mara called me. "Vance's team found your license," she said. "I assumed they would eventually." "Caleb." There was something in her voice that I hadn't heard before. "They're not happy." "They won't be. You're a licensed PE with 14 years of structural experience, and you've been operating here as a handyman for 6 months and no one knew." "Mara, why didn't you tell anyone?" I thought about how to answer this. Because I needed to understand the building before I needed anyone to understand me, and because I'd spent 3 years being a credential on a form at a firm that used my license to manage liability. I wanted to do actual work. I wanted to see if the work was right before I put the flag on it. There was a silence on the line. "That's either very principled or very strange," she said. "Probably both," I said. Another silence. Then, "The council meeting is at 7, be there." The morning of the 14th, Preston Vance was standing on the sidewalk in front of the Aldridge Mill with his clipboard men. I was across the street with Nora and a coffee that had gone cold. "That building is condemned," he said and laughed. He did not know I was there. He was performing for his men for the general audience of a project going according to plan. The laughter was the laughter of a man who expected to win. Nora pressed her shoulder against my hip. "Okay," she said. "The council chamber in Millhaven seats approximately 200 people. It was full. I had not anticipated this." Delia had, apparently, because she arrived 15 minutes before the meeting with Ruth and Ruth's son-in-law, and a woman from the community garden, and approximately 40 other people who filled the public gallery in a way that made Councilman Harrell, seated at the council table, visibly recalibrate something. Preston Vance sat in the front row of the gallery with his lawyers. He was wearing the coat. He had the easy posture of a man who had been in enough of these rooms to know how they usually ended. Before the meeting was called to order, I watched Vance's lead lawyer, a man from a Louisville firm whose card I'd seen when his letter arrived, lean toward Vance and say something in a low voice. Vance listened without looking at the lawyer. He was looking at the crowd, reading it the way I read buildings. After a moment, he said something back without turning his head, and the lawyer sat back and wrote something on his pad. Whatever Vance had said, it hadn't changed his posture. He still had the posture of a man who expected to win, but there was something now in the set of his jaw that hadn't been there when I'd seen him on the sidewalk that morning. He knew the room had changed. The meeting was called to order at 7:03. Councilman Harrell ran through the agenda with the efficiency of someone who wanted to get to the vote and passed it. He summarized the condemnation order, the demolition petition, the timeline for Vance's development project, and its projected economic benefit to Millhaven. He had a PowerPoint presentation that someone had put together, renderings of the hotel, projections of tax revenue, a bar chart of anticipated jobs. The bar chart was optimistic in the way that development bar charts always are. Mara presented the historic preservation case first. She was composed and precise, and had a presentation with photographs that she narrated without notes, because she had been making this argument in her head for months. She cited the mill's architectural significance, its place in the county's industrial history, its potential for adaptive reuse. She cited comparable preservation projects in 3 neighboring counties: a 19th-century tobacco warehouse in Lexington converted to apartments, a textile mill in Georgetown that now housed a brewery and event space, a cotton gin building in Bowling Green that had been rehabbed into commercial studios. All 3 had generated tax revenue. All 3 had become civic anchors. She cited the State Historic Preservation Office's preliminary review, which had been completed in 72 hours following her submission, a review that characterized the Aldridge Mill as a significant resource of local and regional historic importance and recommended against demolition pending a full engineering evaluation. Then she sat down and said, "The structural assessment will be presented by the project engineer." I stood up. The room was very quiet. I had not worn the coveralls. I was in the clothes I wore when I testified before review boards, dark jacket, open collar, my report bound and tabbed in the way that engineers bind reports when they know the report will be scrutinized. I had brought 6 copies, one for each council member, one for the record. I handed them to the clerk as I walked forward. "My name is Caleb Marsh," I said. "I hold a professional engineer's license in structural engineering from the Commonwealth of Kentucky, license number PE 28847S, issued in 2010, and in continuous good standing. I have 14 years of licensed practice in structural assessment, rehabilitation engineering, and historic structure evaluation. I have reviewed the Aldridge Mill building in detail over the preceding 6 months, and I am prepared to present my findings." The room was quiet. I looked at Councilman Harrell. He had the expression of someone who had received information he needed to reorganize. I looked at Preston Vance. He was still. The lawyers were not writing anything. One of the citizens in the back row said something to the person next to them and then went quiet when I looked in that direction. I began. The presentation took 40 minutes. I walked the council through the structural frame first because the frame was the argument. I had photographs taken at each stage of my assessment: the iron columns at ground level, the primary beams at the mid-span points, the foundation system in the sub-basement, the floor-by-floor condition documentation. I had the timber lab results from Louisville. I had load calculations I had run against both the 1887 construction specifications and against current commercial building code, and I had printed those calculations in the tabbed appendix so that anyone who wanted to challenge my numbers could do so against the actual math. I walked them through the difference between envelope failure and structural failure. This was the core of it, the distinction that Gary Prewitt's condemnation report had not made because Gary Prewitt was a code inspector and the distinction was not his job to make. The Aldridge Mill's envelope was failing. Its plaster, its caulking, its window seals, its parapet waterproofing. These things were in poor condition and needed to be addressed. They were the building's skin. They were not the building's skeleton. The skeleton was another matter. "The wrought iron columns are exhibiting surface oxidation consistent with a building of this age that has experienced some humidity infiltration," I said. "Surface oxidation, not section loss. The column cross-sections are intact. I have bore scope images in the appendix showing the interior of 2 columns. They are clean metal, no pitting, no internal corrosion." I walked them through the timber analysis. I read the lab's findings directly: heartwood density, moisture content, absence of fungal infiltration. I explained what old-growth white oak was and why it behaved differently from modern dimensional lumber, and I did this in language that a council member with no engineering background could follow, because that was who I was talking to. I walked them through the floor-by-floor findings: the secondary joists on 3 and 4 that showed real distress and needed to be sistered, the decking on 4's north corner that needed replacement, the primary structure on all 4 levels that was sound. And I walked them through the rehabilitation pathway: the scope of work required to bring the building to current code, the sequencing, the cost range I had developed with input from local contractors who had done comparable work. "The structural frame of the Aldridge Mill," I said, "is in substantially better condition than the condemnation report indicates. The building's primary load-carrying system, the wrought iron columns and old-growth timber beams, is intact and sound. The failures documented in the condemnation report are real but are confined to the secondary systems and the envelope. They are repairable. Demolition of this building is not warranted by the structural evidence." I sat down. There was a moment of silence in the room that lasted about 5 seconds and felt longer. Then Councilman Harrell said, "Mr. Marsh, can you explain why you have been operating in this community for 6 months under a contractor's permit rather than disclosing your engineering credentials. I had expected this. I came to Millhaven to understand a building, I said. I wanted to understand it on its own terms before I asked anyone to accept my conclusions. My license is public record. The assessment I filed is a licensed engineering report and carries all the professional and legal weight of such. What I chose to wear while I did the work doesn't change what the work says. Harold looked at me. You're saying the report stands regardless of how you presented yourself, he said. I'm saying the building stands, I said. The report is describing something that's already true. One of the other council members, a woman named Patricia Gaines, who I'd been told had grown up on the same block as the mill, looked at me over the top of her reading glasses. Mr. Marsh, she said, you have 14 years of structural engineering experience. I do. And your professional assessment is that this building should not be demolished. My professional assessment is that the structural evidence does not support demolition. The building's bones are sound. What it needs is repair, not removal. She looked at me for a moment. Then she looked at the report in her hands. Then she looked at Councilman Harrell with an expression that did not require translation. The council voted 4-3 to table the demolition order pending a full engineering review by a state-certified structural firm. It was not a victory. It was a pause, but a pause was what I needed. What happened in the 6 weeks after the council meeting was less dramatic than what preceded it, which is often how the real work goes. The state-certified firm, Walsh and Associates, out of Lexington, came in and spent 3 days at the mill and produced a report that agreed with mine in all material respects and differed from mine in one. They went into the sub-basement. The 4-3 vote had been the closest possible margin that wasn't a defeat, and I knew it. I knew Councilwoman Gaines had been the deciding vote. I had seen her face when she asked me about my experience, and I had understood that she was not asking for information she didn't already have. She was asking in front of her colleagues to put her reasoning on the record. Whatever happened next, her vote was documented. What happened next was that Preston Vance's lawyers filed an injunction against the tabling resolution, arguing that the council had exceeded its authority in imposing a delay on a previously approved condemnation proceeding. The injunction failed in circuit court in 11 days. It was the kind of legal move that was not meant to succeed on its merits, but to demonstrate seriousness and consume time. I had expected this. I had also, in the week after the council meeting, received 2 phone calls that I hadn't expected. The first was from the editor of the Millhaven Courier-Journal, a man named Dennis Bauer who had been at the council meeting and who wanted to write a feature about the structural assessment. I agreed to speak with him under one condition. The story would be about the building, not about me. He agreed, and the piece ran on a Thursday, with photographs of the interior I'd taken, and a sidebar that explained, in terms accessible to a general reader, the difference between a building's structural system and its envelope. Dennis was a careful writer. The piece was accurate. The second call was from a woman named Claire Aldridge. She was Ezra Aldridge's great-great-granddaughter, she said, and she had read the Courier story, and she had something she thought I should know. We met at the diner on Route 12 on a Saturday morning. She was in her 60s, white-haired, had driven up from Bowling Green. She ordered coffee and put a manila envelope on the table. My grandmother kept some of Ezra's correspondence, she said, letters to the engineer, and some letters back. The letters in the envelope were photocopies. The originals were in a family archive, she said, and she'd had these made years ago, not knowing quite what to do with them. They were correspondence between Ezra Aldridge and Albert Soule, dated between 1885 and 1888. The construction years. I read them slowly. Aldridge's letters were businesslike, direct, the letters of a man who knew what he wanted and expected to get it. Soule's replies were longer, more technical, and occasionally contained the kind of mild exasperation that I recognized from my own professional correspondence. The engineer trying to explain something to a client who was not quite understanding what he was being told. In a letter dated March 1887, Soule wrote to Aldridge about the structural frame. He had specified the iron columns at a larger section, than Aldridge's initial budget had allowed for. Aldridge had pushed back on the cost. Soul's reply was patient and precise. He explained load path, he explained load distribution, he explained what happened when a building's primary structure was underspecified and the building aged. He used the word generations twice. Aldridge had written back a single line, "Do it your way." I sat with that letter for a long time. "He listened to his engineer," I said. "He did," Claire Aldridge said. "My grandmother always said he trusted the man he hired. She thought that was the reason the building lasted as long as it has." I looked at the letter. "May I have a copy of this?" I said. She pushed the envelope across the table. "I made that set for you." The letters went into my file. They did not change the structural analysis, but they explained something that the structural analysis couldn't explain by itself: why the building had been built the way it had. Ezra Aldridge had been willing to spend more because Albert Soule had been able to make him understand what the money was for. Two men, 138 years ago, had had a conversation about the difference between building something to a budget and building something to last. The result of that conversation was still standing on River Street in Millhaven, Kentucky. Walsh and Associates came in at the end of July. I had never met the principals at Walsh. I had read 2 of their published reports on comparable buildings and found their methodology sound. I gave them full access to my documentation, every photograph, every measurement, every lab result from Louisville, and stayed out of their way while they worked. They spent 3 days at the mill. I knew when they found the structural frame because I happened to be in the building on their second day, checking some measurements for the purchase calculation I was running, and I saw the senior engineer from Walsh standing at the base of one of the iron columns with his hands on it and a particular expression on his face. I recognized the expression. I'd had it myself, the first time I came down from the scaffolding after getting close to the primary beams. I didn't say anything. I left him alone with it. Their report arrived 2 weeks later, 41 pages, organized differently from mine but arriving at the same conclusions in all material respects. The structural frame was intact. The rehabilitation pathway I had outlined was feasible and correct in scope. The condemnation order was not supported by the engineering evidence. They had also gone into the sub-basement, and they had found the sealed door. And they had noted it and recommended further investigation and moved on. I opened it. I went back on a Thursday in late August, alone, with a chisel and a headlamp and the slow building certainty that I had been circling this for months. The plaster seal on the door cut away in sections. The door itself was wood, heavy, tongue and groove planking, swollen with time but not locked. I worked it open with steady pressure and stood in the light of the headlamp while the seal broke and air moved in both directions. The room was perhaps 12 feet square. Stone walls like the sub-basement proper. A wooden table against one wall, its legs reinforced with iron strapping. On the table, and on the shelving that ran along 2 walls, were rolls of paper in pasteboard tubes and flat sheets in leather portfolios, and a series of bound volumes that I recognized after a moment as calculation logs. The original 1887 construction documents for the Aldridge Mill. I stood there for a long time. Then I sat down on the floor of that sealed room, under a headlamp, in the sub-basement of a building that everyone had told me was beyond saving, and I began to read. Ezra Aldridge's engineer from Cincinnati had been named Albert Soule, and Albert Soule had been meticulous. The calculation logs documented every structural decision in the building, written in the careful hand of a man who expected his work to outlast him. The framing specifications were there. Old-growth white oak, minimum 18-inch dimensional stock, heartwood only. The iron columns, wrought iron from a Pittsburgh foundry, specified at twice the minimum load requirement of 1887 code. Twice the minimum. I pulled out my phone and did the calculation against current code requirements. The original design, as specified in Albert Soule's 1887 calculation logs, exceeded the current Millhaven commercial building code by 31%. Ezra Aldridge had built a building for the next century and a half. He had not been sentimental about it. He had been precise. I sat there for a while longer. Then I took photographs of everything, cataloged everything, and carried the bound calculation logs upstairs into the light. I called Mara from the parking lot. "I found the original construction documents," I said. Silence on the line. Then, "Where?" "Sealed room in the sub-basement. Sol was the engineer. The original framing was specified at twice the 1887 code minimum load. The current frame exceeds modern code by 31%. Another silence. "Caleb," she said. "Yeah, this changes everything." "It confirms everything," I said. "It was already true. Now there's paper." The purchase closed on the 14th of September. The price was below market, distressed property, receivership sale, the city motivated to move it off their books. The bridge financing Delia had arranged converted to a conventional loan at close. I signed the documents at a table in a downtown title company, and Nora sat beside me and drew in her sketchbook and did not ask questions, because she had understood since February where this was going. I did not see Preston Vance at closing. He had withdrawn his demolition petition 6 days after the construction documents became part of the public record. He had not made a statement. His lawyers had filed the withdrawal without comment. I did see him once more not long after closing. He found me at the mill, or came to the mill knowing I'd be there, which I suspected was closer to the truth. It was a Tuesday morning, early October, the air gone sharp. I was on the second floor reviewing the decking replacement scope when I heard him on the stairs. He looked different without the clipboard men. Smaller, maybe, or just less performed. He stood in the doorway of the second floor room and looked at the frame the way a person looks at something they've been trying not to think about. "The iron columns," he said. "Wrought iron," I said. "1887, they're not making it anymore." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I watched my father lose everything to a building he couldn't let go of. I swore I'd never be sentimental about concrete." I looked at him. "This isn't sentimentality," I said. "This is engineering." He almost smiled. "Not quite." "No," he said. "I suppose it isn't." He left without saying anything else. I heard his footsteps on the stairs, and then the street door, and then nothing. I stood in the second floor room of the Aldridge Mill and listened to the river. The work took 11 months. I managed it myself, with a crew of 6 that I built slowly. A mason named Harold Briggs, who had worked historic brick for 30 years, and who had the hands to show for it. 2 carpenters named Joe and Cal, who had the patience for old-growth timber joinery, and who spent the better part of a week on their first beam repair, getting it right to their own standard before I said anything. An electrician named Terrence, who had done 3 other mill conversions in the region, and who arrived at our first meeting with photographs from each one, because he assumed I'd want to see them, and he was right. I also brought on, in the 4th month, a young woman named Priya, who had just finished her structural engineering master's degree at University of Kentucky, and who had emailed me after reading the Walsh and Associates report in the public record, asking if I needed an assistant. Her email was 3 paragraphs and contained no grammatical errors, and cited the original Sol calculation logs by specific page and figure number. I called her back the same day. Priya was 24 and had the relentless precision of someone who was still new enough to the profession to believe that every detail mattered. She was right, of course. Every detail does matter, and the experienced engineers who have learned not to sweat certain things have mostly learned which things are safe to let go. Priya hadn't learned to let anything go yet, which meant I occasionally had to slow her down, but mostly meant that the level of documentation she produced on the project was the best I'd seen in my career. We repointed the brick. Harold and his laborer spent 7 weeks on the exterior envelope, working from scaffold that I designed to integrate with the iron column anchors, so we weren't running blind penetrations through the wall. Historic brick repointing looks simple and is not. The mortar specification has to match the original in strength and composition, or you create a moisture trap, and a moisture trap in a masonry wall is a long-term structural problem that announces itself about 15 years after the bad repointing job and requires the whole thing to be done again. Harold knew this. He had a mortar sample from the original construction, extracted from a protected section near the foundation, and he matched it the way a craftsman matches something. Not by formula alone, but by hand. We replaced the secondary joists on 3 and 4, sistered alongside the originals where the originals were salvageable, full replacement where they weren't. The original timber we removed, the pieces that were too far gone, we milled into flooring for the residential units on the upper floors. There's a principle in historic rehabilitation. You don't throw away the material, you find it a new use. The wood that had carried the third floor for 130 years became the floor of the apartment on 4 that eventually became mine. We redecked 4's north corner. We made the parapet weathertight. We ran new mechanical and electrical through the building in a way that respected the frame. Conduit runs parallel to or alongside the beams, never through them. Penetrations through the floor plates sized and located to maintain the structural system's integrity. I reviewed every mechanical drawing, every electrical drawing, every plumbing rough-in. Priya double-checked my reviews. The building inspector who came for the framing inspection was a woman named Sandra Park who had a structural engineering background and who walked the frame in the same careful way I did, running her hands along the iron columns, looking at the beam connections, spending a long time on the upper floor framing. "This is remarkable," she said. "Albert Soule built it to last," I said. She looked at me. "Who's Albert Soule?" "The engineer who designed it, 1887. She ran her hand along an iron column. "He did good work." "He did," I said. She signed off on the inspection without comment beyond that, and then spent another 20 minutes walking the building a second time that wasn't part of the inspection, just because she wanted to. I didn't say anything about the extra 20 minutes. I understood it. The sub-basement got its own attention. The sealed room, Albert Soule's document vault, as I'd come to think of it, was opened up and cleaned carefully. Priya spent 2 days doing a condition assessment on the documents, consulting with a paper conservator in Louisville who came out to look at them. Most were in better condition than we dared to hope. The sub-basement's dry, stable thermal environment had done exactly what sealed, below-grade stone construction can do when everything goes right. The leather portfolios had kept the flat sheets flat. The pasteboard tubes had kept the rolled drawings safe. The conservator, a careful, methodical woman named Dr. Andrea Reyes, treated each document and helped us arrange for their long-term care. The calculation logs went to the Kentucky Historical Society, on permanent loan, with a full digitized copy retained at the mill. The construction drawings were framed in archival UV filtering glass and installed in the sub-basement proper, which we turned into a small interpretive space accessible from the ground floor. Visitors to the building would be able to walk down and see Albert Soule's drawings on the wall, read his calculations, understand what he'd built and why. I liked this. I thought Albert Soule would have liked it too. Nora was there for most of it, after school, on weekends, through the winter and into the spring. She had her own hard hat, yellow, slightly too big, which she wore pushed back on her head in the way that made Delia laugh every time she saw it. She learned the names of the crew members. She learned what a mason's trowel was and why mortar consistency mattered, and how you tell old brick from new by the sound it makes when you tap it. She started drawing the interior. The columns, the beam connections, the way the light came through the upper windows once we'd replaced the plywood boarding with new glazing. The drawings got better. They got more structural, less picturesque. She was starting to draw what the building was doing, not just what it looked like. "Dad," she said one Saturday in April, sitting on the second floor with her sketchbook while I reviewed shop drawings. "When is it going to be done?" "End of summer," I said. She drew for a while. "What's it going to be?" she said. "Mixed use. Commercial on the ground floor, maybe a restaurant, maybe some studios. Residential on 2 through 4. We'll see what people want." "Can we live here?" I looked at her. "There's a unit on 4 with river views," I said. "I was thinking about it." She nodded like she'd already decided this. "Okay." The building opened officially, structurally complete and certificate of occupancy in hand on the 1st of September. I did not throw a party. That's not the kind of thing I do. What I did was walk through the building alone on the morning of the 1st, starting in the sub-basement, the sealed room now open, Albert Sol's documents preserved and framed on the wall in archival glass, and moving up floor by floor to the fourth. I walked the same path I had walked on my first assessment visit 2 years before. Sub-basement to ground to 2 to 3 to 4. I moved through each floor the way I moved through structures during assessment, slowly, not looking at what I expected to see but at what was there. What was there was a building that was alive again. On the ground floor, the commercial tenant, a restaurant called Aldridge Table, owned by a woman named Sonia who had grown up 3 blocks away and who had wanted to open a restaurant in Millhaven for 8 years and had been waiting for the right space, was doing prep work in the kitchen, which was not yet open to the public but was fully operational. And the smell of something roasting moved through the space and mixed with the smell of the new mechanical systems and the cleaned iron columns and the old brick that had been repointed and was still, in some sections, releasing the slight mineral smell that repointed masonry releases in its first weeks. On the second floor, a design studio had taken 2 of the commercial units. The principal was a man named Marcus who had driven down from Cincinnati to look at the space after seeing the Courier-Journal feature and who had stayed in Millhaven for 3 days, walking the building and talking to me and looking at the river views from the east windows, and then had signed a lease. He had not told me why he'd left Cincinnati. I had not asked. I understood the instinct. Third floor, 4 residential units, all occupied. A retired school teacher. A couple who had moved from Louisville for quieter lives and who had a baby that I had seen exactly twice, once in the hallway and once through their open door, sleeping in a mechanical swing. A young woman named Taryn who was a nurse at the Millhaven Regional Hospital and who had told me, when she signed her lease, that she had driven past the mill every day for 4 years and had always thought it was beautiful and had assumed it would be torn down. "I'm glad you bought it," she said. "I'm glad it let me," I said. She had looked at me oddly and then laughed, which was the right response. The 4th floor was mine. I had finished it last. Original brick walls, new windows that framed the river, a kitchen that Delia had helped me design because she was, as she informed me, not going to watch me live in a space without proper storage. The floors were the original decking, sanded and finished, and they were level the way the floors of a well-built building are level. I stood at the 4th floor window and looked at the river. The mill had been Ezra Aldridge's building for 30 years, and then it had been used by other people for 80 more, and then it had been abandoned for the better part of 2 decades, and then it had been condemned. And now it was inhabited again, which was closer to what a building actually is. Not an object to be owned, but a system to be occupied, something that only fully exists when it is doing what it was made to do, which is to hold things up, to make room for lives to happen inside it. Albert Sol had understood this. He had built the frame for the lives that would come after him. He had specified the iron and the timber and the load, and the span for generations of people he would never know, and he had written it all down in calculation logs that had sat sealed in a stone room for 136 years, waiting. I heard the stair door. Nora came through it with her hard hat pushed back on her head and her sketchbook under her arm and be 2 steps behind her, and the 2 of them stopped in the middle of the 4th floor and turned slowly in a circle the way children do in a space they're trying to understand with their bodies. "It doesn't smell like wet," Nora said. "No," I said. "Not anymore." She came and stood beside me at the window, looked at the river, did the thing she did where she filed something away before she said it. "Dad," she said, "that man said it was condemned." "He did, and then you bought it." "Yeah," she pressed her shoulder against my hip. "And then you fixed it," she said. I put my arm around her. Outside, the river moved the way rivers move in September, the summer's weight gone out of it, the current cleaner, the light lying across the water in long flat sheets. "The frame was always sound," I said. "I just had to prove it." She leaned into my side, not leaning, just present. "I know," she said. "I knew from the beginning." 3 weeks after the building opened, Mara came to see it. She came on a Saturday morning, when the building was quiet, the commercial spaces on the ground floor still being fitted out by their tenants, the residential floors above occupied but not yet fully settled. That particular state of a building coming alive when the people in it haven't yet formed their routines, and the place still feels provisional. I showed her the sub-basement first, because the sub-basement was where it had started, the sealed room now open, Albert Sol's documents framed on the wall, the calculation logs in a glass case that Dr. Reyes and the Historical Society had helped us install. She stood in front of the case for a long time. "Twice the minimum load requirement," she said. "Twice the 1887 minimum. 31% over current code. Ezra Aldridge built for the next century. Albert Sol built for the next century. Aldridge just had the sense to hire him." She smiled at that. It was the kind of smile that reached something specific, not the general polite smile she used at council meetings and permit hearings. We went upstairs floor by floor, and I showed her the mason's work on the repointed brick, which was as close to invisible as good pointing work is supposed to be, and the carpenter's work on the timber joinery, and the new windows, and the restored iron column bases, where we'd removed decades of paint and found the original surface treatment still intact underneath. On the second floor, she stopped in front of one of the iron columns and ran her hand along it the way Sandra Park had, the way I did, the way people do when they're encountering something genuinely old and genuinely intact. "Harold told me about this," she said. "The original surface treatment. Japanned black," I said. "It's a heat-applied finish. You apply asphalt-based material at high temperature, and it bonds to the iron. It was the standard practice for structural iron in the 1880s. Under 60 years of paint, it was perfect." She kept her hand on the column. "It's strange," she said. "I've spent 15 years trying to get people to care about this kind of thing, the craft, the material integrity. Most of the time they look at me like I'm speaking a language they've decided not to learn." "You've been speaking the right language to the wrong audience," I said. She looked at me. "What's the right audience?" she said. "People who understand that things can be built to last," I said. "Not everyone does, but there's more of them than you'd think." She was quiet for a moment. On the fourth floor, she stood at the window and looked at the river. The light was doing what October light does on water in Kentucky, flattening and going silver in the afternoon, the surface of the river moving with that particular slow deliberateness that rivers have in the early fall. "What made you sure?" she said. "Back in January when you first saw it, before you'd been inside. What made you sure?" I thought about this. "The building's posture," I said. "The way it was standing. A structure with failed bones doesn't hold its face like that. I could see it wasn't settling, I could see it wasn't bowing. The surfaces were failed, but the thing underneath them wasn't." She was quiet. "That's what you saw," she said. "That's what I saw." She turned from the window and looked at me. The thing in her eyes that I'd been being careful not to name for months was still there, patient, not demanding anything. The same quality I'd noticed in February in Phil's office when she'd looked at me and recalculated. Whatever she saw, she kept looking. For 9 months of meetings and permit hearings and council chambers and the long, slow work of a building coming back, she'd kept looking. "I'm glad you came back," she said, "to Millhaven." "I am too," I said, "even with everything it cost. The leave from the firm, pulling up Nora's school. She's fine," I said. "She's better than fine. She's teaching the second grade class next door about structural load paths." Mara laughed, a real laugh, the kind that arrived before she could manage its presentation. It was a good sound in the room. "And you?" she said when the laugh settled. "Are you fine?" I looked out at the river. I thought about January, standing on the sidewalk in front of a condemned building, understanding something had shifted. I thought about the sealed room and Albert Sol's calculation logs, the numbers that proved what I'd already known. I thought about Nora's yellow hard hat pushed back on her head and Delia at the dinner table saying the bones were sound, she just needed me to come look. "Yeah," I said, "I think I am." She held my gaze for a moment. Then she looked back at the river. "Good," she said. Outside, the October light lay across the water in long flat sheets, and the building held us up the way it had always held everything it was given to hold. Quietly, precisely, without asking for acknowledgement. The night before Thanksgiving, Delia came to dinner in the fourth-floor apartment with Ruth and Ruth's son-in-law, and a bottle of bourbon from a distillery in Bardstown that had been in business since 1881, and that Delia had chosen deliberately for the date. 1881, she said, pouring. 6 years before the mill was built. You planned that, I said. Of course I planned that, she said. Nora was in the kitchen with B, the two of them working on something with apples and a recipe they'd found that required more bowls than I owned. The sound of their conversation carried through the apartment, not the words, just the texture of it, two 9-year-olds solving a problem together with great seriousness. Ruth's son-in-law raised his glass. To the building. To Albert's soul, I said. He built it to last. We drank. Delia looked at me over her glass with the expression she had when she had known something for a long time and was only now permitting herself to say it. You know, she said, when I called you in January and told you about the mill, I wasn't only talking about the mill. I looked at her. I know, I said. She held my gaze. The bones were sound, she said. I just needed you to come look. Outside the fourth-floor windows, the river moved in the November dark, and the building held us up, all of us, the living and the work and the quiet accumulation of days, the way a well-built thing holds what it's meant to hold. Not because it had to, because it was made right.